trouble locating my cordless mic, but we'll find it somewhere. Offer prayer to St. Anthony. Hopefully y'all can hear me with this. We'll look tonight at Revelation chapter 8 and 9. We looked at Revelation chapter 7 last time. And of course last week we had a break because I had to preach a mission at another church. But let's first just take a moment in prayer, gathering all the anxieties, our tiredness, our excitedness, our whatever in the course of this day. Just gathering all of that to bring that to God as we seek to be nourished more deeply by His Word. Let us pray. Lord God, be with us this evening, especially as we journey deeper into the book of Revelation, especially its weirder parts, and help us to truly know You, leading us and guiding us through this foreign land, that we don't get caught up totally by the fantastic and the imagistic, but that we seek You who are behind all things and above all things. We make this prayer through Christ, who is our Lamb, sacrificial Lamb, and our Lord, always and forever. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay. So, as I said last week, we looked at chapter 7. Remember, chapter 7 functions sort of as this interlude, a necessary interlude between all this sort of fantasticness that chapter 6 gave us with the unsealing of the scroll and the seals that were, the part of the scroll, right? And so we sort of have this vision of a redeemed Israel, the 12 tribes, and then also this vision of a multitude that no one could count, right? And sort of if you will, establishing what was characteristic of other parts of the New Testament, which is the primordial election or choice of Israel that is never done away with, right? God's chosen people, the Jews, and then, of course, the message that goes beyond the confines of traditional of Israel to the Gentiles, to the rest of the world, right? The nations. And that seems to be sort of underlined with the two visions in chapter 7 of Revelation. So the chapter 8, though, takes up again the unsealing of the seals, and it's the final seal of the scroll that's broken open, and then that unleashes then a further point, or rather a deepening with the cycle of the trumpets, right? And so, remember, I've drawn it out before numerous times. You've got to sort of think of Revelation as sort of these circles, these concentric circles, and things keep coming around again and again, told perhaps in different ways, but effectively saying a lot of the same thing, right? So, we're going to come to the cycle of the 7 trumpets. So, just to help us, right, you have like the initial vision of John in the early chapters, and then you get the vision of the one who sits upon the throne and the Lamb, right? So this is correct worship of God. And then that then corresponds to, then we have the cycle of the 7 seals as they are broken open, the Lamb taking the scroll, breaking open the seals. And then now we get this furthering, right? But notice they're concentric. Well, a good geometrist would have been able to make them concentric, not me. But And so now we have the cycle of the trumpets. And, a lot of people want to say, that there's a linear progression to Revelation. And the only linear progression to Revelation is the victory of God over evil, right? And the triumph of good. That's the only linear progression. But this sort of continual, the battles, if you will, that play out on the earthly sphere also play out in the heavenly sphere, right? And they play out in all of creation. And so those things are told and retold in different ways. So now, this further cycle of 7, the seals now break open, if you will, to then being blown open, right? In the announcement of the trumpets. You need to think, though, perhaps more, don't think of a symphony orchestra trumpet. Think of the shofar. The shofar was the ram's horn, right, which functioned, it was a blown instrument, that produced this, large sound, right? It would announce, like a call to worship or a call to assembly or a call to arms, a call to battle. So when the shofar is blown in the Old Testament, right, that announces very important things, okay? So think of that idea as the trumpets, right? The shofarim, and to pluralize the Hebrew word shofar, as they are blown, right? And they announce, the assembly to worship, to prayer. They announce people to arms. They announce when great visions are happening. Think about, again, the Sinai event in Exodus 19 and 20, that when all of that momentous and cataclysmic display on Sinai occurs, that, also the people are sort of, linking themselves to that by blowing the trumpet, by blowing the shofar, right? In other words, sort of underscoring the point, like, if you can't see that a cataclysm is happening, we'll make sure you can hear that, something important is going to happen. In other words, all of the senses will be utilized to announce the importance of what is breaking forth. So in chapter 8, we have this. When the Lamb opened the 7th seal, and notice actually there's first a pause. We sort of had an interlude with the two sort of visions of the election or the choice of all of the people in chapter 7. But when the Lamb opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Right? So it's interesting. You're going to have utter silence, and then all of a sudden, you're going to have cacophony. Right? So it's like these powerful opposites. So think about, in moments when you have been very collected to yourself and in sort of silence, and then all of a sudden you hear a sound that just sort of, breaks you out of that very silent disposition, that quiet disposition. Silence has a way of focusing, right? In a powerful way. It may be in some sense also prepping, right? Preparing for whatever might be coming down the road or the pike. If you sort of compare and contrast these opposite silence and then just sheer noise. But it's noise that is going to attract and demand attention. Also, silence, if you will, demands attention as well. So it's interesting, right? These sort of pairing of these opposites that in some way communicate the same type of thing, right? So the 7th seal breaking open creates this silence, right? It's almost, if you will, they're rearranging the stage setting, right? that was all about the breaking open of the seals. And now you're going to have the drama of the blowing of the trumpets, right? Or the shofarim. And I saw that the 7 angels who stood before God were given 7 trumpets. Okay, so it's sort of setting the stage. Eugene Peterson notes this. I think this is good. The apocalypse is a fusion of vision and prayer. It's just not all about things seen. When the 7th seal is opened, there is silence in heaven for about half an hour. A climax has been reached. The silence prepares the imagination to receive an incredible truth. While conflicts raged between good and evil, prayers went up from devout bands of first-century Christians all over the Roman Empire. Massive engines of persecution and scorn were ranged against them. They had neither weapons nor votes. They had little money and no prestige. Why didn't they have mental breakdowns? Why didn't they cut and run? They prayed. Right? They prayed. It was in order to hear those prayers that there is silence in heaven. Out of the silence, action developed. An angel came before the altar of God with a censer, right, or the thurible. He mixed the prayers of the Christians with incense. And he'll go on and talk about all of that. Okay, so notice that this is very preparatory. This prayer, the silence, the idea of focusing. Notice that when Jesus, before he goes to the cross in the Passion accounts, which we heard yesterday, or Matthew's version yesterday, that he prays, right? He prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. And in fact, the text really goes to great lengths to show him praying. Even like verbalizing that, he wishes, desires that this cup, the cup of suffering, would pass from him. But not what he wills, but what God wills, right? He gives himself over to the will of his Father. But there's this great sort of focus on the prayer. You can sort of see the aloneness, right? It's the seeming loneliness with which Jesus is filled in the moment. But he's not completely alone. He's in the presence of the Father. But there's not this cacophony going around, huh? In some ways, here in chapter 8 of Revelation, we sort of see that similarly worked out. That the silence is sort of focusing for this great liturgical act. What's the next thing that happens? Another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a gold censer. Right? So this is the, it can also be, the term is a thurible. Right? So the thurible or the censer, C-E-N-S-E-R. Thurible or censer. This is the thing that contains, and it could be like sort of maybe what you've seen in the celebration of Mass, where it's sort of on a chain and it's slung, right? That's a censer, that's a thurible. You know, that there could be very small ones, very large ones. Have any of you ever walked the Camino de Santiago in the north of Spain? Or if you get to the church of St. James, right, of Santiago de Compostela, there's this gigantic thurible or censer sort of swing. Like, you don't want to get in the way of this one because it will kill you. It will, right? I've always wanted to like swing the smaller version of the thurible, the censer that I have at Mass when I'm swinging it, you know, particularly as I'm passing by perhaps one of my enemies so that it hits them on their head. No, not really. But anyway, the thurible or the censer there in Santiago de Compostela is huge. And perhaps you've seen things on YouTube or videos where, it takes like 4 or 5 guys as they pull the ropes, to get it going, right? It's gigantic. So you can have censers or thuribles like that swing, but you can also, they can be stationary as well, okay? Perhaps like a bowl, if you will, and this is what burns the incense, right? Or the various, and incense can be made of, different smelling things, usually in some sort of, nice aroma. The description of the temple of Jerusalem, right? If you look back into it, it has, of course, the altar of incense, at which it's puffing out a lot of smoke, right? At a basic level, before all of the spiritualizing about what smoke and incense means, why would the temple have, like its own altar pushing out a lot of like sweet smelling or nice smelling smoke? Why do you think?
Practically.
Yeah, practically.
To get rid of the smell of all the stuff that had been sacrificed.
Exactly, right? What's the temple system doing big time? Slaughtering animals. You think that smells good? No, right? No. So, and you have to have something that's going to sort of like, beautify the air. Think of, rancid. Or don't think of it, because if you don't want to throw up. But think of rancid, decaying flesh, right? The temple was a pretty bloody system in terms of, the action of the doing of the sacrifices, right? Of lambs and goats and birds and, perhaps other animals, and those would have been the main ones, though. But that this is constantly going on, right? And so you need something to sort of, and so mask over that smell that's happening. So that's the very practical understanding of the usage of, like incense, a sweet smelling, fragrant, balsam or, frankincense or whatever. Usually this comes from a type of a plant or flower or resin or things like that have this, sort of nice smell to it, right? Of course, in many cultures, even outside of Judaism, used, the burning of these, plant materials, because there are a lot of religions that, did and offered all forms of animal or even human sacrifice, right? So, that's the real basic anthropological reason, huh? Now, over time, there a spiritual reason, takes off, floats up, no pun intended, huh? It's like in the language of the psalmist, right? "O Lord, let my prayers rise before you like incense." So the incense, the rising up of this sweet and fragrant smoke, right, that's being burned is sort of seen as, and then of course the sacrifice of the animals that's happening as well, because they're being burned too. That all of that sort of creates this over the top, just in your face sensation. Just imagine walking into, that. I mean, we live in some sort of antiseptic times, but you've got the smell of incense, you got the smell of flesh, you got a lot of sweaty human beings pressing on each other, right? Just imagine just the sheer, olfactorial experience that's going on. It could make one almost, perhaps, feel sick, right? It overwhelms, right? And that's sort of the desired effect as well. The sort of overwhelming power of these things that sort of override the senses or overwhelm the senses. So you got shofar blowing, right? Prayers chanted, fire going, right? The flesh of animals being burned, the vegetable products here, the plant or the plant resins or oils or flowers, being burned also to create this, sickeningly sweet smoke. All of that is going on. I really want you to enter into the effect of this. It's not just sort of some intellectual exercise. This is a real entry into something very experiential, right? And so you have then the Revelation picking up on that, imagery that would have been part and parcel of the temple system in Jerusalem, though no longer by the time Revelation is written, but it's not too far in the distant past or the distant memory of these people. And so, and again, remember what we've established before is that, what John is sort of peering into is the worship of God, and sort of this heavenly worship reflects, or the only metaphors or symbols or images that he can use to get at, heavenly worship, well, is what has been the experience of earthly worship, right? So particularly in the temple, right? In the temple in Jerusalem. Maybe also he's piggybacking on a lot of what goes on in a lot of the pagan temples, right? In the Roman Empire also. Because they're doing the same type of sacrificial system also, of animals, and you have the incense, right? But of course he wants to reveal true worship of God. Huh? So, this angel came and stood at the altar holding a gold censer. He was given a great quantity of incense to offer, along with the prayers of all the holy ones, on the gold altar that was before the throne. And this is exactly sort of the setup. If you read about the description of the temple sort of schematics in the Old Testament, in Exodus, okay, and what becomes the Temple of Solomon, and then, of course, in the second temple, by the time of Jesus. Any of you ever seen like on the internet or really well done displays of what they think that the temple in Jerusalem looked at by the time of Jesus? And particularly after Herod the Great's sort of big construction reforms of it, it was probably quite a splendid and sight to see, particularly as you were approaching Jerusalem. Because remember, Jerusalem is high, and you traveled up to Jerusalem, so you would have seen the temple and the Temple Mount from miles away. And it was adorned with gold and all of the stuff. It was probably just this, powerful, powerful sight to see, particularly as one was a pilgrim approaching it. Huh? And so here, as John talks about this sort of setup, that the gold altar that was before the throne, This is sort of how the temple itself is set up, right? You've got the temple, the incensation altar, you have the sacrificial altar, and then of course, that'll eventually lead into the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, where, in times gone by, where the Ark of the Covenant was. And so this was, purportedly where the Lord God dwelt. But you sort of have this movement into, the very center. It comes, you approach the very center from the outside, moving through these progressive forms of worship, right? The offering of the incense, the offering of the animal sacrifices, eventually leading to, the Holy of Holies, which only, the high priest could enter, not just anyone could go into it. Right, so the smoke of the incense, and notice that the incense it talks about the prayers of the holy ones, right? And we've seen the holy ones mentioned before, right, in chapter 6. When the fifth seal is opened, right? The souls of those who've been slaughtered, they're under the altar, right? And they're crying out, how long? This is in chapter 6, starting at verse 9. How long will it be, holy and true master, before you sit in judgment and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth, right? And so, so there they are, sort of like waiting under the altar, And then in chapter 7, there's a reference to, to the holy ones. These are the saints, the holy ones. And so this idea of the prayers, if you will, of the holy ones mixed with the incense. So again, sort of like, in some sense, he's channeling that language from the psalm. Lord, let my prayer rise before you like incense. The offering of my hands as, or my hands raised up as an offering of praise. By the way, this is a very ancient posture of prayer. They call the Orans position, right? The arms stretched out and the hands, palms up, if you will, or palms exposed. It's an ancient depiction of prayer, and it was, used. You see that a lot of like the catacomb paintings or catacomb drawings in Rome. This is particularly how the ancient Christians would pray. So, as if signifying by their body this sort of upward movement, right? You can Google the Orans, O-R-A-N-S, the Orans position of prayer, So the incense, the smoke, is sort of representative of the prayers of the holy ones. They went up before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with burning coals from the altar, and hurled it down to the earth. There were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake, right? So now the silence is broken. Sort of that preparatory quality of focus that prayer signifies. And now, the cataclysm, round 2 is going to be unleashed. We saw round 1 in the depiction unveiled as the seals are unbroken, or rather the seals are broken. And now we'll see it as the trumpets sound forth, right? So, you have this, dramatic language. And again, this is sort of Sinai language. This is what happens when they approach Mount Sinai, the thunder, the rumblings, the flashes of lightning, the earthquake, the quaking of the mountain, right? The burning of the smoke. So, again, this sort of over-the-top, dramatic language whereby both silence, but then also this are meant to, capture our attention as to what is happening. So then the 7 angels who were holding the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them, right? When the first one blew his trumpet, there came hail and fire mixed with blood, which was hurled down to the earth. A third of the land was burned up, along with a third of the trees and all the green grass. Well, you know, that's a nice hardening image. Again, John isn't just pulling this stuff out of thin air either. Let's jump back in the book of Exodus. By the way, did you guys get some hail yesterday? Yeah, I got some. Yeah. I immediately thought of this passage. Let's go to Exodus chapter 7, starting at verse 14. So the first plague, right? There's going to be a correspondence somewhat, and then he's going to sort of mix his metaphors or mix his plagues as, you know, he unpacks this scene. So you have this first scene of fire and hail mixed with blood. So what's that about? So fire and hail mixed with blood. You know, it sort of seems over the top. I think you're having a flowing together or a confluence of some of the different plagues that happened in Egypt. Now, what were the plagues about? You know, in the book of Exodus. The plagues were about establishing what? That God was greater than the Egyptian gods, right? That's played out sort of in the heavenly sphere, right? But now how that's playing out in the earthly sphere is between whom? It's between Pharaoh and Moses. Okay, so sort of Moses is, if you will, he's on team Yahweh, right? And Pharaoh is on team, you know, however, you know, 2,502 Egyptian gods there are, or whatever. You know, probably like the chief god Ra, or you know, various ones of them. You know, Pharaoh in his life was even seen in Egyptian cosmology as a godlike figure. Okay? And isn't that, of course, also what the Roman emperors, right, Caesars, were wanting themselves to be depicted as? You know, of course, they had to get a vote of the Senate, right, to sort of make it happen. But that they sort of had this, you know, semi-divine or divine-like status. They were known as sons of God, right? You know, the Filii Dei, the Son of God, or the sons of God. So it's not for nothing then that John of Patmos is going to draw on the imagery in the book of Exodus, because he sort of sees himself in what the Christians, you know, his Christian brothers and sisters, you know, they're sort of like a new Israel, right, in a different time. And they are, to some extent, or he sees them as being, you know, persecuted or enslaved, and they're going to have to be liberated. And he's going to show that the Lord God, right, the one who sits upon the throne, and the Lamb, Jesus Christ, are greater than the Roman gods, right? And that Jesus is a greater one than the emperor, as Moses is a greater than Pharaoh, right? So in some sense, he's sort of saying, hey, this story's already been told. But if you don't know it, I'm going to tell it to you again, but give it my, you know, my own twist, right? And so just like the accounts of the plague narratives, starting in Exodus 7, they, progress in a way to ultimately show that Yahweh, the Lord God, is stronger than, is greater than the Egyptian gods. And Moses is the Lord God's servant, because Moses is connected to the true God, whereas Pharaoh and his priests and priestesses, they're connected to those at the end of the day that really don't have any power. So the first plague is the water that's turned into blood, right? Remember that happens in the Nile. And then you'll have these sort of animal plagues of the frogs. The third plague is the gnats, or the gnats. The fourth plague, the flies. It's like a horror movie, right? And the fifth plague is like this pestilence or this disease. The sixth plague, the boils. Seventh plague, the hail, right? See, there you have the hail. Remember, so in our first trumpet, you have hail and fire mixed with blood. So in some sense, what sort of presents itself linearly in the story of the plagues, John wants to sort of say, no, this isn't like something that's sort of, gently, or gradually sort of presents itself. Rather, this is very dramatic from the get-go. Right? So when the first trumpet blows, the angel blows the first trumpet, when the shofar sounds, we're having called up to mind, if you will, just by reference to fire and blood and hail, we're having called up to mind really the entirety of the plague narrative in Exodus. Okay? So that, and if you thought just one plague in Exodus was enough, right? If you saw the Nile River turned to blood, that might be enough to do it for me. Remember, John always likes to do things on steroids, right? So he's going to say fire and blood and hail mixed together, right? As if, that'll certainly get your attention, right? That will certainly capture one's imagination as to, this is, something different is happening here, Again, sort of like I always think it's one of the most funniest scene in a movie, but it also drives home, remember in Ghostbusters, right? I think I might have told this, right? When the guys have been hauled into the mirrors. I'm talking about the original Ghostbusters, the 1984 Ghostbusters. It's almost going on 40 years ago, right? When the Bill Murray character, they start talking about, oh, this is this real wrath of God type of stuff happening, right? The end of the world, fire and blood and hail and earthquakes and this, and then, he said, dogs living with cats, right? Dogs and cats, that line just that makes me laugh so much. But anyway, his point though is that, when you see all of these things happening, it better get your attention, because one is not in Kansas anymore, right, at all. Right? You're no longer in a world of gray. You're a brightly colored pastels and technicolor going on, okay? So, and this is where John is wanting to emphasize it. It's not just even sort of like he's going to tell the story of the plague narrative again. No, he's going to amp it up, all right? Because this is not just about deliverance from some slave power, and letting a people go free so that they can have their own land. He says, no, this is life and death, cataclysmic. It's about, are we going to have real and true form of worship of God, or are we going to fall in for this sort of diabolical demonic system of worship, right, of the Roman Empire? Are we going to give true allegiance to the one who sits upon the throne, who is God, and to the Lamb, who is Jesus Christ? Or these mere imitations that at the end of the day seek to do violence to us, right? Remember the real binary, dualistic quality to the book of Revelation, huh? It really wants you to choose. You got to choose. It's not like, oh, well, I'm going to try to have it both ways. No, John is saying you can't have it both ways. You have to decide, right? Whose side are you going to be on? Right, so, and notice that this already begins to, if you will, eat up creation. A third of the earth burned up, a third of the trees burned up, and all the green grass burned up. So the things that are about life, it's coming to a reversal of order, huh? The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So notice that there's this real upset, if you will, of the economic order, right? The fields and the earth. Remember, in Israelite and Jewish cosmology, they'll often talk about the Lord God, who is the creator of the earth and the skies and the sea, right, or the waters. So they'll talk about all of creation by specifying land or earth, sky, and sea. It's sort of like those are the domains of creation. And that all of that is getting upset. All of that order, remember like sort of Genesis 1, in which there's this perfectly harmonious and orderly way in which it all is created, light and the waters above and the waters below, and then the waters below divided into the earth or the land and the sea, and then those various domains are then populated with the creatures that pertain to them in the next set of 3 days. So there's this order, there's sort of this poetic order to the days of creation, the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1. So God divides and separates basically in the first 3 days, establishing the various domains and the various places that are then going to be populated or colored, if you will, by the creatures that are then described in the 4th, 5th, and 6th days of creation. So that's sort of being undone, right? You have the earth first identified as becoming, to some extent, toxic, right? Poison. A third of the earth burned up, a third of the trees and the green grass. Then with the second angel blowing the trumpet, this great mountain burning with fires thrown into the sea, so that the sea itself becomes like blood. So it's sort of like the Nile River becoming like blood. Remember, the Nile River, it's not for nothing that the first plague in Exodus is what? Is the turning of the waters of the Nile into blood. Why? What had happened a couple chapters earlier? The Pharaoh had done such a dastardly deed to highlight his power over the Israelites so much that it became practically demonic. He had their babies killed, right? And where were the babies' bodies thrown? Into the Nile. And what's the Nile in the Egyptian mindset? The Nile is the center of their economy and their life, right? There's an orderly flooding of the fields that occurs by the Nile, throughout the year. This is the Nile, it's not for nothing that the Nile was one of the ancient places in which civilization first developed, just from a historical point of view, right? Because there was a real order as to, how it would rise and fall and flood, and they were able to then sort of, work with that schedule to establish the fertility of their fields. And that Pharaoh himself was willing to corrupt the lifeblood, no pun intended, of the Nile for the Egyptians, to the point that he was willing to, have the babies destroyed. So the Nile itself, in some sense, turns against its own people. Instead of being the source of life, it becomes a source of death. So, that's going more into the earlier chapters of the Exodus story, but then we see how that's played out. So that's in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. And of course you have the famous call of Moses that will then lead to then the accounts of the plagues there in Exodus 7, and the first one being the turning of the Nile into blood. It's not for nothing that happens, because in some sense Egypt has brought it upon itself in what they have done, what Pharaoh has done. And Pharaoh is representative of the people of Egypt, right? So we see then that the earth has become toxic in the first trumpet. The sea becomes toxic, right? And the economy, remember, Rome's economy depended fundamentally and primarily upon the shipping of goods from its far-flung provinces along the Mediterranean, right? It was an empire that encompassed practically an entire sea, right? If you looked at, ancient maps or maps of the ancient Roman Empire, it surrounded the Mediterranean Sea practically from its, westernmost point to its easternmost point, So that the trade and economic livelihood that they're dependent upon in terms of the land, that becomes corrupt. And now the sea, that becomes corrupt and toxic also, right? A third of the sea became blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. And now by this number, the third, please don't act like a mathematician or an engineer and want to say, this is 0.33333333, some 0.4. No, this is meaning to indicate a lot, right? This is a significant amount. That in effect the whole thing becomes toxic. Okay? The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven. So now, and this is going to upset the sky now. See, earth, sea, and sky. So, the domains of life. The third angel blew into the fourth trumpet. That will continue. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and the springs of water. So now this is affecting the fresh water. So you have the depiction of the sea being affected, which of course is the mode of transportation, and also life and livelihood. But now you have the fresh water, that which is drinkable, right? That's being affected. Right? So all of creation is being affected by this upsetting of the order. This is the undoing, the upsetting of the good order, right? Remember, God sees everything that He makes on each day in Genesis 1 and finds it good. So all of creation, if you will, is in some sense falling apart, right? God creates cosmos from chaos. He creates order from disorder, but now the reverse is happening, right? Chaos has re-entered into cosmos. disorder has entered into order, right? It's upsetting everything. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. So wormwood, was a tree plant that had a very bitter taste to it, right? Also, interestingly, right, isn't it in the C.S. Lewis work, right? Screw tape letters, right? Isn't who's the one that's addressed? Is it Wormwood, or is Wormwood doing the writing? No, Wormwood is the one. Is this young demon addressed by his uncle Screwtape, right? Isn't that, did I get that correct? Yeah. So by C.S. Lewis, right? So it's a master of Christian fiction. He fictionalizes this sort of account of how the demons and the power of evil can tempt human beings, right? And it's these set of letters, these fictionalized letters, written by dear Uncle Screwtape to his nephew, who's like this younger demon. His name is Wormwood, right? And so it might be something, C.S. Lewis is being inspired by the passage here in Revelation. That wormwood itself, at least in Revelation's account, causes this sort of, embittering, this undrinkability of the waters of life, right? And so C.S. Lewis might be playing on that same idea, to, if you really want to screw up human beings, right? Uncle Screwtape writes, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, this is how you are to do it. You want to basically make their lives bitter, where everything sort of falls apart. Okay, so that's just a little aside. Classic text, though, the Screwtape letters by C.S. Lewis. So the name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many died from the water because it was made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light was darkened. A third of the day was kept from shining, and likewise the night. So in the first four trumpets, remember, Revelation likes to play out these series of seven to sort of, insert a breaking, a breaking point in between. And so we have in the first four account, the first four trumpets, basically the undoing of the created order. Earth and sea and fresh water, right, and sky. So all of those domains that were, if you will, perfectly ordered and separated by God along the first 3 days in the story of creation in chapter 1, and then populated by the corresponding creatures that belong to them or pertain to them in the next set of days, the next set of 3 days in Genesis 1. All of that is sort of undone. Okay? Then I looked and I heard an eagle crying with a loud voice as it flew in mid-heaven, "Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth at the blasts of the other trumpets that the three angels are about to blow." As if the first four weren't enough, right? To sort of make us all go, to head for the hills, right? Back there in chapter 6 of Revelation. What was it there in chapter 6, starting at verse, when the sixth seal happens, right? The sun becomes, in chapter 6, verse 12, the sun became black as sackcloth, the full moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree drops its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll, rolling itself up in every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth and the magnates and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of the one seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Right, so this is just another depiction of that. And it's now the eagle, right, this bird of high flight announces, well, if you think that was bad, right, now I'm going to show you something, even worse. As if, how could it get worse? But it just, it does, right? It's when you're having a bad day already, you've had a migraine headache, nobody at work likes you, right? Your kids are sick, you're dealing with, other relatives, and you got the next door neighbor who's bringing a lawsuit against you, and you're asking, how could this get worse? And then all of a sudden you're rear-ended, right, by some car, right? Yeah, that's how it can get worse. Remember, if you think that, if you absolutely think, that, oh man, I've just been through the ringer, nothing else could possibly happen, right? What do you think the dinosaurs were thinking 66 million years ago? The poor Triceratops that was just getting the crap beat out of it by the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and all of a sudden you see this flaming thing through the sky. That was not a good day to be alive on the earth, okay? So, I'm just going to be very Irish at this point. If you think things can't get worse, trust me, they can, okay? Think again. And so this is the point here, right? So as it moves into chapter 9, the continuation of the saga of the trumpets being blown, right? Chapter 9. The fifth angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. Now there's this sort of linking of the idea of a star to sort of angelic or demonic powers, okay? So this may also be why, the star wormwood. This goes back in ancient Jewish cosmology and sort of spiritual angelology. This whole tradition of the fallen angels and things like that. That again are very fascinating, but way beyond my expertise. We can sort of research some of that stuff together. But you now have this idea of another sort of angelic / demonic figure that is fallen to earth. So notice that the other thing is that these, so even not just the physical we live in a pretty materialist worldview and think, only the physical is real, but that, the levels or the creatures of creation that are beyond just the material, right? They have their place in their established order as well. And they're not supposed to commingle or interfere. And so the fact that you have what are referred to as stars, but probably, is a reference to sort of, these otherworldly or heavenly or angelic, and, the opposite side of angelic is demonic. These demonic figures, them sort of coming to the earth, this sort of upsets everything, right? It pollutes, it toxifies the creation, because everything is out of order now. Remember, in the Jewish mindset, everything had its place. This goes into the whole law of clean and unclean, right? Why you can eat certain types of food, and why you can't eat other types of food. Why you can wear certain types of material, and why you can't wear other types of material. Why you can plant this particular set of crops this way, and why you can't plant this particular set of crops another way. All this stuff that seems sort of strange to us, but this goes to that because everything has its order. right? So it's deemed clean or unclean or pure or impure. And it's all about it being in order or out of order. Why blood outside of the body by necessity makes one unclean? Because blood belongs in the body. So if you have, wounds that are profusing, right, flowing of various types, why this sort of designates that someone is in a state of uncleanness, and they have to go through the ritual. First of all, they have to make it stop, and then they have to go into this ritual whereby they are deemed to be back in order, right? Clean again. So you have the whole clean, unclean system, the order-disorder system is all run amok now. Everything is, higgledy-piggledy, it's just all sort of commingled. It's not supposed to be this way, right? That which pertains to heaven or the sky, it's supposed to be there. That which pertains to the earth is supposed to be there. That which pertains to the waters or the sea is supposed to be there. And now it's all disjointed, right? It's all out of order, right? This cataclysm has happened, huh? And so you have this fifth angel that's blown the trumpet, a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. This particular angelic creature, this demon, though that word is not used here, okay? He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke, like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth. So notice this mixing then again of the imagery from the plagues in Exodus. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given authority like the authority of scorpions of the earth. Weird, right? They were told not to damage the trees of the earth or any green growth of any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. Right, we'll talk more about that next week. They were allowed to torture them for 5 months, but not to kill them. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings someone. Don't know if any of you have ever had that experience. Yeah. And in those days, people will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. Right? So yeah, I think I do want to go back to just the first 4 trumpets, right? And, not to have ever heard the whoa, 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 issuing forth from the eagle. Because basically saying if you thought the first 4 were bad, wait until the next 3 trumpets are blown. And certainly that seems to be, everything is out of order. So much so that people are actually wishing to die, right? Longing to die, that it would take them away from this chaos, and yet they can't, right? They're not allowed to, right? So, oh my God, everything is just like, those who are alive, we don't wish death, right? We of course know that when death comes, there's nothing we can do about it, mostly, but to the extent that actually life itself has become so hard, so turned upside down, that people are actually wishing for death, and they can't, as a type of arrest, and they can't even find it. Huh? So yeah, it doesn't look good as the trumpets are blown, and these powerful images, which again, and I'll finish here, it's sort of like this concentric circle. As the seals were basically revealing this. Earlier chapters of Revelation were revealing this. And it's almost like the idea of, the principle of public speaking. Huh? Tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them, and you tell them what you told them, right? Yes. Revelation keeps hitting that, but it keeps amping up. It keeps amping up. Look, I told you it was going to be bad. Now I'm telling you it's bad. And I'll tell you in a few more minutes just how bad it's going to be. right? And it's like, oh yeah, maybe we do want to be like what Jesus told the women of Jerusalem. Yeah, you're going to be wishing for the hills and the mountains to cover you, right? In other words, you're going to be wishing to be buried under, fathoms upon fathoms, or, meters upon meters of rocks and dirt, because at least that way you won't have to see or smell or taste or hear or feel or touch the decreation, the uncreation, maybe that's the right word, right? The disorder, the deharmonization, right? The destruction, right? Notice our word destruction, it's got that de prefix in Latin, which is about undoing, typically. It means to undo, or to be the opposite of. Another word sort of signifying the opposite. The root of the word destruction is the word for structure, right? And structure is order. Structure is about being put together in the right way. Structure is about everything has its place, and everything has its, its end, in the sense of the thing towards which it tends. It has a purpose, right? And all of a sudden, destructure, right? Destruction. The order is completely removed, right? And everything is, you ever see The Never-Ending Story? You guys see that? Remember the nothing? You have this beautiful land and the journeys of the hero. And this story, is great. It sort of follows the typical hero story. That's part of human life. Back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And one of the probably the earliest, sort of heroic story that we have. Probably like 3rd millennium BC. But anyway, the never-ending story, right? There's probably some idea there. What sort of happens? This beautiful order and all of that of this place and this land and this creation continues to be eaten away by nothing, and it's actually sort of personalized. The nothing, right? The anti-order, you could call it. The structure falls into destruction, right? And so at this point in Revelation, we're sort of seeing this, the harmony and the structure and the order and the cosmos, with which everything was, established and given life and form. It's returning to what? Remember back in chapter 1 of Genesis, we often talk about the fact that, the first story of creation in the first chapter of Genesis is all about God's creative activity. Brings order out of, brings things to order, brings things to cosmos. But remember that in the first verse, what is the description of the earth as God begins his creative enterprise? It's an enigmatic Hebrew phrase, tohu vabohu. Our translation, I think, says, it's like the earth was formless and void, right? It was empty. It was something was there, but it was without shape or form. There was no structure, right? And remember that it sort of signified that by the Spirit of God, or the breath of God, the Ruach of God hovers over the waters. Because, water for the ancient mind is the primordial symbol or image of that which cannot be controlled, or that which is emblematic of chaos. think about poor California right now, right? They were in horrible drought. And now they are not looking forward to what? That snowpack melting in the summer, because that is going to just intensify their floods, right? This is the uncontrollability of water. We moderns sort of think, yeah, we've got it all under control. We are sadly and sorely mistaken, right? But this is this idea that somehow the order and the structure and the form and everything that makes sense, the sensibility, the rationality, the reasonability, and all of that is, if you will, returning to that original formless void and space that the very first verse of Genesis chapter 1 describes the earth as before God begins his creative work, right? The earth was formless and without void. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters, the ancient waters, because ultimately, it's only God and the true God, not the Roman depiction of the gods or the Roman emperor, that can bring real order and true cosmos and true structure and true form and true rationality and true reasonability and true logic to life and the universe and everything. And I think in sort of the negative way, Revelation, the Genesis way is wanting to describe that positively. The Revelation way, at least in this part of Revelation, is wanting to describe that negatively. Basically offering the choice, like, you want a life without worship? You want a life without the true God, the one who is upon the throne and the Lamb? Well, this is where it's going to lead. Formlessness and void, as like the earth before creation began. Okay, so on that happy note, I'll stop. And we'll meet again next Monday, Easter Monday, perhaps with a little more good news, right? So we're in Holy Week, we're in the